The snow had started falling again by the time we reached the tree line, slow at first, dry and powdery, barely clinging to the shoulders of our coats. But the wind made sure we felt it, slicing across the mountain slope with a bitterness that reached through every layer of fabric. We left the last stretch of plowed road behind 2 hours earlier. From here on, there'd be no more tire tracks, no ranger posts, no occasional signals bouncing off the hills. Just this narrow path carved between frozen pines, leading deeper into the upper basin, where the maps grew vague and the weather turned faster than you could react. Our boots crunched in rhythm as we hiked in single file. No one spoke. There wasn't much to say. A few paces ahead, Harris scanned the slope with that restless energy of his, tapping his GPS against one gloved hand like it would work better if he threatened it. He was the closest thing we had to a second lead, mostly geology background, sharp eye for terrain, but impatient with just about everything else. The antenna on his pack bounced in time with his steps. Behind him trudged Lena, adjusting the strap of her snowshoes every few minutes. She was quieter than usual today, her breath coming in steady plumes as she kept her head down. Veterinarian by training, wildlife behavior specialist by trade, she was the reason half of our motion cams were baited and half weren't. I learned not to question her system. Bringing up the rear was Torres, the youngest of the group, usually the loudest too, but not now. He was staring off through the trees, gloved hand resting near the ice axe clipped to his pack. His footfalls were heavy, slower than the rest of us. Something in the air had gotten to him. Maybe it had gotten to all of us. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set camp, the wind had died, but it didn't feel like calm. It felt like something had shut the mountain off. No birdsong, no branches swaying, no distant creak of snowpack shifting. Just silence as deep and wide as the sky above us. Even the snowfall was quiet, dry flakes settling gently on our sleeves, untouched by breeze. It made the world feel padded, like we'd stepped into a place muffled by something older than weather. We took our time setting up. There was no sense rushing in the cold. It only made you clumsy. I unpacked the solar array and radio gear while Harris hammered down the last of the tent stakes. Lena started boiling water from the stream that had already frozen over in the shallowest parts. Torres unpacked the sensor kit and began marking the perimeter, more out of habit than necessity. Still, something about the stillness lingered. The radio crackled once, then nothing. I adjusted the dial. Static. Moved the antenna. Brief signal, then gone. We were close enough to the ridge that we should have caught something. But the air was flat. Too flat. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped hard. The thermometer on my vest read -12. I caught Harris staring at the trees, really staring like he expected them to move. Lena noticed too. She stepped beside me and kept her voice low. "You feel that?" I nodded. "It's like we're being watched." We didn't elaborate. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't sound stupid out loud. But she was right. The feeling had been there since we crossed into the basin, like something was observing us from the trees. Not aggressively, just aware. That night, we sat around the camp stove instead of a fire. Open flame was dangerous this deep in the snowpack. We shared a few bites of rehydrated food and took turns scanning the trees. No one mentioned the silence again. It didn't need to be said. Around midnight, I took a short walk to relieve myself and check the perimeter. That's when I saw the first one. A patch of ice, perfectly smooth. Too smooth. Not like something thawed and refroze, but like glass. No tracks nearby. No runoff. No explanation. Just a frozen oval about 2 feet across, untouched by snowfall, with faint concentric ripples barely visible beneath the surface. I knelt beside it. The air was colder here. Still no sound. Not even the crunch of my own knees in the snow. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous, exactly, just out of place. On the way back to camp, I noticed a tree stripped bare of bark. Not weathered. Not clawed like a bear would. Peeled. The trunk smooth and pale, grooves curling in looping spirals from base to branch. I ran my gloved hand over one of the cuts and felt the wood pulse with cold. Not warm cold. Like it was pulling heat from my palm. Back at camp, I didn't say anything. I just sat down next to the stove and watched the snow fall again. Still too soft. Still too quiet. A few hours before dawn, Harris woke me up. His voice was tight, eyes fixed on a tree lean just past our camp. I swear I saw something move. I stood, grabbed the flashlight, and swept it across the forest. Nothing. Just pines and ice and shadow. But the beam felt weaker than it should have, as if the dark was absorbing it. We stayed up after that, watched the ridgeline until the sky began to lighten, just enough to see the next wave of snow rolling in. That morning, we packed what we needed and hiked further in. We'd come here to monitor migrations, elk mostly, but nothing was moving. Not a single track. Not even birds overhead. Somewhere near the edge of the next ridge, Lena stopped. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "We're not alone out here." Torres glanced at her, then at the trees. But he didn't argue. The air had shifted again. Still silent, but heavier now. Denser. Like we'd stepped into someone else's space. None of us said it aloud, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something was already watching, and it didn't want to be seen. We stayed low the next morning, huddled in the cold, waiting for the storm to pass. The radios were still down, just white static hissing in and out of range. Outside the tent flap, the snow came steadily, not in flurries or bursts, but in a quiet, relentless drift that seemed to thicken with each hour. Around midday, I walked the perimeter alone. I needed to move to stay warm, and part of me wanted space from the others. We'd slept in shifts the night before, but none of us really rested. The air was brittle against my face. The trees beyond the camp stood still and colorless, just pale trunks and branches powdered in frost, vanishing into the fog that pressed close from all sides. There were no tracks, no birds, no sound at all except the soft crunch beneath my boots and the faint scrape of wind against the nylon tent. I rounded the edge of the clearing and stopped short. At first, I thought it was a tree, just another shadow tucked between the pines. But the shape was too large, too rigid. It stood upright, massive and wide-shouldered, its surface a patchwork of pale gray broken only by long streaks of what looked like scarring. The snow around it remained undisturbed. No prints, no path in or out. Too small. Pale lights burned where eyes should have been. Couldn't move. The air around me had gone quiet, not just quiet in the usual sense, but heavy, oppressive. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. Couldn't even hear my own breath. The shape never moved. It didn't raise a limb or shift its weight. Just stood there, half swallowed by fog and trees, glowing eyes fixed in my direction. I backed away slowly. My steps made no sound. Even the crunch of snow had vanished. I don't remember getting back to camp. I only remember stepping into the tent, heart pounding, mouth dry, my hand shaking so hard I couldn't work the zipper behind me. I told the others what I'd seen. Jess asked if it might have been a bear, though even she didn't sound convinced. Rachel stayed quiet. Tom rubbed his hands together by the stove and said nothing for a long time. That afternoon, the wind picked up and brought with it a heavier front. We spent most of the day digging a trench around the tent to divert runoff. It didn't help much. Snow leaked in at the corners anyway, and the cold settled into our boots and seems like it meant to stay. By early evening, our GPS was dead. The satellite signal flickered, then vanished. We tried the radio again, still nothing but static. Tom went out just before dusk to dig out the snowpack behind the vehicle. The slope had shifted slightly, and we didn't want to risk a small slide pinning it down. We heard him shoveling for a while, then nothing. Jess poked her head out of the tent flap. A few seconds later, she called me over. Her voice was low, almost flat. The SUV was buried. Not just dusted or piled up from drifting snow, but completely swallowed, like an avalanche had picked only that one spot. The vehicle's antenna stuck out like a broken stick, and that was it. No sign of Tom. No sign of movement. Just a sloped white mass where the slope hadn't been an hour earlier. We called his name. Waited. Circled the edge. Nothing. I tried to dig with my arms first, then with small camp shovel, scraping snow and ice until my fingers went numb through my gloves. But it was packed solid, compressed like stone. Jess pulled me back. "We'll get him out in the morning," she said, but her voice barely held. We retreated to the tent as the storm picked up. Rachel paced inside, biting her nails. I kept checking the zipper flap, watching the edge of the trees through the mesh. There was still no sound. No birds overhead. Not even wind rattling the branches. That night, none of us slept. The snow fell harder, tapping against the fabric of the tent in a steady rhythm. We lay bundled, eyes open, counting seconds between gusts. Sometime after midnight, I stepped out with the flashlight. I needed to see if the slope had changed. Needed to breathe air that didn't taste like fear. The clearing was half buried, the snow now waist deep in some places. The trees stood like statues in the fog. I turned in a slow circle, shining the beam across the landscape. Just beyond the tree line, between two trunks, I saw it again. This time closer. The same figure. 10 feet tall, bare-skinned, ribs sharp beneath stretched gray flesh. Its arms hung low, and its head tilted just slightly to one side, like it was studying me. Those pale eyes gave off no glow now, just dull reflection. No steam from its breath. No cloud of warmth in the cold. And no sound at all. The world around it was silent. I raised the flashlight higher. The beam cut through mist and snow, but the shape didn't move. It just stood there. Then I noticed the trees near it scratched. 4 deep lines gouged into the bark at shoulder height, the same across 3 trunks in a row. The marks weren't from claws. They were too wide. More like pressure. Like something massive had dragged a frozen branch across the wood and peeled it back. I stepped back once. Twice. The light wavered. My fingers had gone numb. The creature took a single step forward. And that was when the sound returned all at once. The wind, the snow shifting, my own breath hitching hard in my throat. I bolted for the tent. Inside, the others were still awake. I didn't have to say anything. Jess looked at me and knew. She grabbed the last flare from her pack and laid it beside her. Rachel moved closer to the center of the tent without speaking. We all sat like that, staring at the canvas walls, waiting for the silence to come back. It didn't. Not fully. But none of us slept, and when morning came, the snow had stopped, but Tom was still gone. Where the SUV had been, the slope had flattened. No sign of digging. No exposed metal. Just smooth white snow, frozen into the seams between earth and rock. Jess stood there with her hands buried in her pockets, eyes locked on that blank space for a long time. We didn't speak much that morning. The blizzard closed in quicker than we could react. There wasn't enough time to search for Harris, let alone make it back to base. The storm didn't descend. It crashed over us like a wave, wind cutting through every layer of gear, snow whipping across our faces even with goggles sealed tight. Visibility vanished in seconds. Our shouts fell flat, swallowed by the wind. All the points we'd used to navigate, tree lines, ridge lines, the narrow track we'd broken through the snow, erased in a white blur. We found the cabin by accident. It sat slumped between 2 leaning boulders, almost invisible until we were right on top of it. Half buried and crooked, it looked like it had been trying to collapse for decades. The boards were gray and splintered, the doors swollen and jammed from years of frost and thaw. But a shoulder and a curse got it open. Inside, the stillness hit like a wall. No heat, but no wind either. The floor gave a tired creak under our boots. Frost traced every seam in the walls, and one section of ceiling had sagged under snowpack but hadn't yet broken through. It held. That was enough. Jess and I moved fast, dragging in what gear we could carry, tossing up blankets as windbreaks. The others filtered in behind us, heads down, bodies hunched, not just from the cold. No one said anything. We gathered in a loose circle on the floor, huddled into sleeping bags beneath flickering headlamps. The silence settled quickly, not the kind you expect in a snowstorm, not just muffled by distance or wind. This was deeper. The same silence we'd felt on the trail earlier, the one that seemed to strip everything down to stillness. Even here, inside, it pressed up against the windows like something trying to get in. Nick broke it first. We'll move out at first light. Try to pick up Harris's trail. This is just a stopover. No one answered. And from the way his voice sounded, even he didn't buy it. Sometime deep into the night, we heard the sound. It started as a soft scrape, too low for wind, too steady for snow. I froze, listening. Another scrape followed, this one slower, like weight shifting against wood. Not on one wall either. It moved, slid across the exterior, circled the structure in a slow, steady path. Jess turned her head to follow the sound. I could hear her breath catch in her throat, but she didn't speak. My hand found the grip of my ice axe. No one moved toward the door. The next sound was different. A heavy thud, muffled but close, right behind where Rachel sat, like something large had leaned in and placed its full weight against the wall. She edged away without turning around. No one made a sound. The room had gone rigid. After that, nothing. No more scraping. Just the fireless dark and the wind pressing faintly at the seams. None of us slept. The light didn't return suddenly. It crept in pale and unfocused, filtering through the frost-covered window like a weak signal. The wind had died. It took us a few seconds to recognize the shift. No one spoke, but we all noticed at the same time. The quiet had changed again. Still no birds. Still no branches stirring. But the storm had passed, and something about the stillness outside felt heavier now. Like it was listening. Nick cracked the door first. Snow had drifted high during the night, nearly sealing us in. He forced his way through and stepped into the cold. One by one, we followed, blinking in the dim morning light. The ground around the cabin was marked. Not boot prints. Not any tracks we could name. Just strange impressions pressed deep into the snow. Too rounded, too even. They didn't walk across the surface. They sank into it, as if something heavy had lowered itself down without taking steps. Jess pointed toward the nearest window. There, too. The frost on the glass had melted in a curved outline, a perfect half-arc at the top edge, like something had leaned in close to look. I stepped forward, brushing the inside pane. Beneath the frost line, faint streaks stood out, long and angled, trailing downward as if claws or fingers had dragged slowly across the glass without enough force to crack it. We didn't speak. We didn't pack. We just started moving. Harris was still missing. The GPS continued to flicker with no signal. And now something had circled the cabin during the night, close enough to leave marks on the windows. We moved higher along the ridge, using what little light managed to reach through the dense cloud cover. But the terrain didn't line up anymore. A narrow creek we'd crossed 2 days earlier now flowed the opposite direction. The slope we followed bent the wrong way. And the trees, they'd changed. Taller now. Older. The spacing was wrong too. Unnatural gaps stretching between trunks in long, cleared lines. Like a path had been made. Or something large had passed through. Rachel pointed toward the next slope, her arm trembling slightly. At the base of the incline, something lay twisted in the snow. At first glance, it looked like a deer, legs rigid, ribs sharp beneath the hide. But the closer we got, the more wrong it became. The skin along its back had been stripped in one clean ribbon, as if someone had started preparing it for tanning. Its jaw hung open, frozen mid-scream, and the eyes, both of them, were missing. Empty sockets, perfectly dry. Jess looked at the corpse for a long moment. Then she turned and walked away. That wasn't the last one. As we continued, we found more. Birds laid out in neat rows, bodies opened along clean incisions like lab specimens. A fox pinned upright against a tree, split from neck to tail, each half peeled back and draped like a macabre display. None of the bodies were frozen solid. Whatever had done this hadn't done it long ago. We crested the next ridge just as Rachel dropped to her knees. Her breathing turned shallow, eyes wide. Jess reached her first. "What is it?" Rachel didn't speak. She raised her arm and pointed forward. The grove ahead was stripped bare. Every tree was pale and smooth, bark peeled in long curls that lay scattered across the snow like discarded skin. But that wasn't what stopped us. Each trunk had been marked, deep vertical grooves, burned into the surface in repeating patterns. Not claw marks. Not chopped. They looked seared in. Symbols without language. Nick crouched beside the nearest tree and ran a gloved hand over the grooves. "Still warm," he said softly. I stood there a long moment before realizing that the silence wasn't just outside anymore. It had gotten into us, too. No one had spoken louder than a whisper in ours. Even our footfalls had gone quiet, swallowed by the snow beneath us. The wind didn't move through these trees. It reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, like the forest was holding something back, or holding something in. By the time dusk fell, we understood. We weren't just being watched. We were being followed. We made camp in a narrow gulch where the tree cover thinned and the slope on either side gave us better sightlines. Jess worked on the comm gear again, spreading out what remained of the signal kit, trying for anything. Rachel built a small fire, not for warmth, but to hold the dark at bay. Nick stood at the edge watching. I barely drifted off before I felt a grip on my shoulder. Nick crouched beside me, his voice low, eyes locked ahead. It's here. I sat up and followed his line of sight. Beyond the firelight, past the last of the tree line, something moved. Not fast, not loud. A shift in the dark. A figure, not quite visible, but present. Its shape wavered like heat rising off snow. Too tall, proportions wrong. It didn't breathe. It didn't blink. It didn't step forward. But I could feel the pressure of its gaze, like standing next to something immense that chose not to move. We stayed frozen. No one reached for a weapon. No one turned away. The fire snapped sharply. Every branch caught at once, sending up a sudden flare of light. And when the shadows settled, the figure was gone. But the silence stayed behind. We didn't wait for the storm to pass. By morning, the cabin felt smaller, like the walls had thinned overnight. No one had truly slept. The fire had burned low, casting long, shifting shadows that never quite settled. We packed in silence, hands stiff with cold, fumbling with rope coils and ration bags. Every so often, someone would glance toward the window, as if expecting that shape to return, frozen against the frost, unmoving and waiting. Only 4 of us remained. I took the lead. We moved east, into the ravine marked as the old watershed. The descent was sharp and narrow, the terrain laced with ice and deep frost heaves. I'd chosen it for the cover, and because it eventually curved toward the nearest ranger outpost, if we could manage to stay on contour and keep moving. But the snow had changed. It no longer crunched or packed beneath our boots. It cracked, slumped, or gave way entirely. Each step either sunk to the thigh or skated forward without sound. The air around us stayed completely still. Pines loomed close on either side, twisted from years of wind but now deathly quiet, like sentinels with their breath held. Even my own movement fell off. I could hear the rasp of my coat when I shifted, but nothing else. No footfalls. No branches creaking. Not even the wind through the trees. Jess brought up the rear, rifle against her chest, not for wildlife anymore. Tomas struggled from the start. He hadn't said much since his fall 2 days earlier, but I'd seen the way he clutched his side. The blood on the scarf he used to muffle his cough. Whatever was broken inside him, it hurt to breathe. He kept close behind me, dragging one foot in the snow with every step. None of us said it aloud, but we felt it again. The creature wasn't visible, but it hadn't gone far. The quiet wasn't just natural hush. It pressed in like a weight. The kind of silence that turned your heartbeat into noise. We passed a frozen stream bed before I spotted the first sign. 3 pine trunks along the edge had been stripped bare. Deep raking lines exposed raw orange sap, frozen solid like amber. In the snow, just beyond, impressions cut deep into the crust veered off into a narrow gully. Not hoof prints, not boots. Wide, round, evenly spaced, as if something massive had moved without lifting its weight. We followed the trail. I don't know why. The tracks didn't wander. They traced a clean arc around dense brush and angled into the gully with impossible precision. No wild animal moved like that. We dropped in one at a time, the slope steep and tightening fast between 2 walls of rock and ice. Visibility shrank with every step. The air grew dim and close, and in that silence, even our breathing faded. I noticed Tomas stop just ahead of me. His shoulders twitched once, violently. Then the snow gave out beneath him. There was no warning crack, no sound at all. Just motion, his upper body jerking, legs vanishing as the crust split open and swallowed him. Jess lunged without hesitation. Her boots skidded as she dropped to one knee and caught his arm. I tore off my pack and grabbed the other. The snow didn't behave like snow. It moved like it was breathing, slackening, tightening, pulsing in slow, uneven waves. I dug my feet into the wall of the ravine and leaned back with everything I had. Jess pulled alongside me. Together we hauled once, twice, until Tomas broke free. His coat had been shredded across the back, and frost clung thick to his shoulders. He didn't speak, just nodded once, barely, lips tinged blue. We left the tracks behind. The gully curved into a wide basin, carved over years by meltwater and long-forgotten rock slides. The footing here was worse. Angled stone hidden under thin snowpack, sharp-edged roots, and frost-warped stumps. We climbed in slow fits and starts, crawling when we had to, dragging each other over fallen limbs and frozen debris. When we reached the center of the basin, the wind returned, but only briefly and only in a small radius around us. Beyond that invisible ring, the air was still again, the silence deeper than before. Rachel stopped and pointed up the slope ahead. There was something standing just beneath the ridgeline. It didn't move. It didn't shift. It simply stood there, tall, lean, and utterly motionless. At first glance, it seemed half-blurred, like the air itself was distorting around it. A shimmer like heat off pavement, but there was no warmth left in this place. No sun, no firelight. Its limbs hung too long. Vein-like patterns crossed its skin in faint, symmetrical webs. It wasn't covered in fur. It made no sound. And somehow, even from that distance, I could feel that it was aware of us. I blinked once. The ridge was empty. We picked up speed after that, half sliding down the far side of the basin, stumbling over loose rock and brittle ice. I kept our heading fixed on a narrow ridgeline that overlooked the lower valley. I needed height, a vantage, somewhere we could stop and think. Tomas could barely lift his feet. He leaned on Jess the entire way, dragging himself forward like his legs no longer wanted to bend. Rachel hadn't said a word since the ravine. She'd begun whispering to herself. No words, just faint murmurs. A loop of sound that didn't seem to belong to her anymore. Near the crest of the ridge, our path was blocked by a collapsed stand of pine, deadfall piled in a tangled wall of frozen branches and shattered trunks. I climbed through first, weaving between the jagged limbs. The wood felt brittle under my gloves. That's when I heard it. Behind us, close enough that I should have felt the vibration. Footsteps on snow. Heavy, rhythmic, even. No shifting gravel, no breath, no snap of branches. Just weight, calculated, unhurried. I turned and waved them forward. My hands stayed tight on the flare trigger. Rachel began climbing. Jess followed, steady but tense. Tomas was still behind them, just starting his approach. He looked up and froze. The thing came from the slope, low and fast, without a sound. It didn't roar. It didn't scream. It didn't even breathe. 1 second, the hillside was bare. The next, it was coming straight at us, arms extended, claws visible, its whole body driving forward in one clean, silent motion. Tomas didn't run. He had no time. The impact lifted him backward off the ground. I didn't hear the collision. I only saw the spray of snow as his body hit the base of a tree and crumpled. Rachel screamed, but no sound came from her mouth. Her voice died in her throat like the air itself refused to carry it. I pulled the flare trigger. Red light burst across the trees, catching the creature in full as it turned its head toward us. It was tall, pale. The surface of its skin shimmered with faint lines, like old burned scars. Its body rippled with movement just beneath the surface. And its face, if it had one, looked stretched and unfinished, as if human features had been pulled across something that didn't quite fit them. Jess grabbed Rachel and dragged her over the deadfall. I reached down and yanked them both through. Behind us, the creature stepped forward once, slow and deliberate. It tilted its head, studying the light, watching. We didn't wait. We ran. Over the ridge, down a slope of hard-packed snow, through a corridor of bent pine trunks, and into the deeper ravine below. The trees blurred around us. The cold barely registered anymore. My breath burned in my chest as I ran. I never turned back. We lost the trail somewhere near the top. The storm came in faster than we could adapt, sweeping over the ridge in a wall of white that erased everything ahead of us. Wind pulled sideways at our clothes, strong enough to stagger, while visibility collapsed to just a few feet. I kept one hand on Rachel's shoulder to make sure she didn't vanish in the whiteout. Jess walked ahead, her arm wrapped tight across her ribs, the flare gun buried inside her coat. She hadn't said a word since we lost Tomas. There were only 3 of us now. The ridge curved around the basin and forced us higher than I wanted to go, but there weren't many options left. The terrain was brittle, the rock beneath our boots slick with crusted ice, and each step threatened to send us sliding. Still, just beyond the blur of snow, I caught a glimpse of something, broad stone surfaces, the faint impression of structure beneath the wind. We emerged into a clearing, carved clean out of the rock and partially shielded by a sheet of glacial ice. The trees here were skeletal and dead, their trunks stripped to pale columns by decades of cold. At the far end, a raised shelf of granite jutted from the slope, etched in worn spirals and symbols that matched the old tribal markers we'd seen scattered in earlier sites. In the center of the platform sat a cracked altar, blackened in places, stained in others. Time had worn the surface down to its bones. I didn't need anyone to tell me. This was the place. The wind dropped for the briefest moment, just long enough for the quiet to fall again, but not the kind of quiet we'd known before. This was thicker, more complete, like the mountain had closed a door behind us. Jess stepped forward with calm, measured steps. At the altar, she lowered her pack and pulled out a bundle wrapped in singed cloth, a flare, likely our last one. Rachel joined her a moment later, setting down a coil of wire and a battered emergency charge we'd carried since the early days of the trip. They moved with a kind of rhythm that didn't need instructions. Each action deliberate, no hesitation, as if they were preparing something sacred or fatal, maybe both. I walked the perimeter, trailing my hand across the stone markings. Even through the glove, the rock felt wrong, so cold it burned. Not the temperature kind of cold, but something deeper, something that felt like it had never been warm in the first place. My fingers recoiled from the surface. When I exhaled, the vapor from my breath didn't make a sound. The pressure in the air shifted, as if the atmosphere around us had compressed. Then everything stopped. Not gradually. Not in a way you could adjust to. The silence just erased everything. Footsteps, wind, breath, heartbeat, all gone. From the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the frozen tree line, the creature appeared. It didn't arrive with violence or noise. It simply moved into view. No sudden lunge, no flash of motion. It walked slowly, its figure emerging from the storm like it had always been part of it. Tall and massive, shoulders broad and hunched, with skin that looked stretched too thin over something harder. There was a color beneath its surface, darker than veins, branching beneath the skin like rot under ice. Its face wasn't blank. It was unfinished. Where eyes might have been, there were folds. Where a mouth should have split open, there was only suggestion. It looked human in the way a stone carving almost resembles a face, recognizable, but wrong in every essential way. Its arms hung low, fingers ending in curved claws so dark they looked charred. When it moved, its feet dragged faintly, not like it was tired, but like the ground resisted having it walk on it at all. Rachel said something under her breath. I don't know if it was a prayer or just her last words, but the silence devoured it instantly. Jess struck the flare. Red light bloomed in the clearing, its glow distorted by the rising steam from our breath and the brittle snow at our feet. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly, the movement careful and curious, as if it were listening to something none of us could hear. And then it charged. There was no build-up, no warning. Just a sudden burst of motion, its entire body surging forward with terrifying speed. The sound never came. Not from its steps. Not from its breath. Not even from the impact that followed. Jess hurled the flare directly at its chest. It struck and held for a moment, flames licking across the creature's torso. But nothing burned. It didn't recoil or slow. It barely acknowledged the fire. I pulled the emergency charge from the altar and yanked the wire loose, dragging it across the stone surface toward the edge. The carvings below the altar flickered in the red light, casting faint patterns across the snow like reflections from underwater. I followed them with my eyes, searching for some clue of where the charge should go. Behind me, I saw Rachel lift her head in time to see the creature bearing down on her. It slammed into her like a falling tree. Her body arced back, vanishing into the snow. I barely saw the landing, just the motion. I ran toward her with the knife drawn, already knowing it wouldn't be enough. But Jess moved faster. She gripped the second flare in both hands and drove it into the creature's side just beneath the arm. This time the reaction came, not pain exactly, but something close. The thing halted mid-stride and turned its head toward her with a sharp, twitching motion, like it recognized her. She stood her ground. Wrapped in her fist was a length of bare copper wire, stripped and looped tight around a salvage detonator fragment. As the beast lunged again, she stepped forward, braced herself, and shoved the wire upward into the seam beneath its jaw. The charge ignited. The explosion wasn't loud. It came as a dense, body-shaking concussion, a sound that seemed to push outward rather than erupt. Blue-white light flared across the clearing, and for an instant the world became pure brightness, snow boiling into steam, trees etched into shadow, the altar painted in molten lines. The creature staggered under the blast. Its frame shifted back a half step, but it didn't collapse. One massive arm came around and struck Jess across the chest with brutal speed. Her body flew sideways into the stone wall, and she hit hard, vanishing in the shadow behind the altar. I lunged forward. The knife in my hand felt like nothing, but I buried it into the side of the creature's thigh with everything I had. The blade scraped against something too hard for flesh. There was no give, no blood. It turned toward me slowly, its face, or what passed for one, tilted slightly, expressionless. Up close, I could finally see the lines carved along its chest and neck. Symbols. Ritual etchings. The same markings we'd seen along the trail, along the stone. They hadn't been painted on. They'd been cut into its body, burned deep by human hands. Not wounds. History. I took a step back and lit our final flare. The flame roared to life in my hand, burning hotter than the others had, its heat forcing my eyes closed for half a second. The creature didn't react to the fire. It simply kept walking, slow now, toward the altar. Its claws scraped along the stone, and every place they touched, frost bloomed in their wake. At the center of the platform, it stopped. There was a moment, barely a breath, where the thing looked almost human. Its posture shifted slightly, its arms loose at its sides, head angled as though remembering something. Then the ice beneath it cracked. The ledge groaned under its weight, and several stone slabs sheared away. The creature began to shift its stance, preparing to leap, but the flare slipped from my fingers and landed at the altar's edge. It rolled once, then dropped out of sight into the crevice below. For a moment, the light vanished. Then it flared again, deep beneath the surface. And the mountain tore open. The emergency charge detonated with a thunderous blast, the kind that didn't just echo. It hollowed the air. Stone fractured. Steam surged up from below. The platform collapsed in a single, groaning heave, and the creature went with it, pulled into the depths by the falling ice and shattered rock. The clearing didn't go quiet. It stayed exactly as it was, still, frozen, waiting. And then, from deep inside the mountain, a low sound began to rise. It didn't scream. It didn't echo. It simply existed, growing like a pressure beneath the stone. Not rage, not pain. A call. One that wasn't meant for us. Then it vanished, and the silence closed back and around us like a vice. I found Jess half buried against the far wall. Her coat had torn clean through. Her ribs didn't move evenly, and her eyes blinked slow, but she was still breathing. Rachel lay farther off, curled near the edge of the platform, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath her body. She was conscious, staring down into the ravine, lips moving in a soundless whisper. None of us spoke. Nothing moved. Whatever had been watching this place was gone. And without looking back, we began the long descent down the mountain. We came down the ridge in pieces. Jess could barely stay upright, so I took most of her weight, walking slow and steady while Rachel kept ahead of us, one arm held tight against her side. None of us said a word. The mountain still felt close. Not just behind us, but listening. By the time we spotted the ranger cabin, the sky had begun to pale. Morning light pressed thin through the cloud cover, dim and washed out, but enough to see the trees again, their limbs bowed under fresh snow. Nothing moved. Not a bird. Not even the wind. The cabin had been abandoned for years, but most of it held together. We found a rusted radio on the desk, dusted in frost. The first few attempts gave nothing but static. On the fourth try, a voice answered calm, clipped, professional. Just over an hour later, 2 snowmobiles pulled up through the trees. The rescue team didn't ask what had happened. They didn't push for details or explanations. They helped Jess onto a stretcher, wrapped us in thick blankets, and loaded us into the sleds without ceremony. I don't think they needed the story. They'd seen enough to recognize the aftermath. Jess was taken straight to a trauma center. 2 broken ribs, a concussion, frostbite on both hands. Rachel's shoulder had dislocated during the fall, and several fingers were bruised deep purple. I walked out with burns down my arm, a torn muscle in my calf, and 2 molars I hadn't realized were cracked until the swelling faded. We survived. That's what mattered. Later that night, I lay under fluorescent lights in a clean hospital bed, staring out the window as snow fell beyond the glass. The storm hadn't ended, it had just moved on. And here, the wind sounded different. Ordinary. It didn't carry that weight anymore. It didn't watch. I told the doctors what I could, just the pieces that made sense on paper. I said we'd been chased into a ravine by a bear, that it slipped and went over the edge. I didn't mention the altar. I didn't talk about the marks on its skin or the way it moved without making a sound. One of the nurses gave a quiet nod when I finished and said, "That mountain's taken a lot of people this year. You're lucky. They offered painkillers." I left them untouched. We were discharged 3 days later. Jess left in a wheelchair. Rachel walked out on her own but moved slower than before. I drove. No one spoke during the ride. Just the soft hum of tires across wet pavement and the occasional flicker of radio static that never resolved into music. We met once more before we left town. It was a small diner just off the highway. The kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Vinyl booths, a dusty window fan, 3 mugs of coffee cooling between us. Outside, the sun was shining. Kids chased each other through a patch of leftover slush in the parking lot. A delivery truck idled near the pumps. Jess reached into her coat and pulled out a folded photo. She slid it across the table without speaking. It was from our first morning, back when we still thought this was just another expedition. The team stood shoulder to shoulder beside the van. Tomas had one arm slung around Rachel. Jess was mid-left. I was caught in a blink, squinting into the sun. And behind us, at the far edge of the frame, half hidden between 2 trees, a tall figure stood still in the shadow. No features, no color, just shape. We looked at it. None of us reached for the photo. None of us needed to ask what it was. Rachel stood first. She hugged Jess, gave me a faint nod, and walked out without speaking. Jess stayed a few minutes longer, watching the window. When she finally stood, she said she was heading west, somewhere warmer, maybe coastal. She didn't say goodbye. Just left. I stayed, ordered another coffee I never touched, watched the shadows stretch across the tile, waited until I was the only one left. Eventually, I went home. The weeks that followed blurred together. A handful of reporters left messages. Some agencies sent an email with a waiver and a vague request for a written statement. I deleted it. No one knocked on my door. No one followed up. But the quiet did. Some nights, I woke to the same dead stillness we'd felt up high. No creaks in the walls, no hum from the vents, no shifting air. Just an absence, thick and cold, like something pressing its ear to the house. One morning, I found frost on the inside of the window. The heat had been running all night. Another time, I stepped onto the porch and saw a piece of cloth pinned to the railing. It was burnt along the edges and bound with twine. A single curved mark had been scratched across the surface, deep, as if etched by something heavy and sharp. I left it there. I didn't touch it. A week later, I packed what I needed and left town for good. The snow has started again in the high country. Tourists will return soon, eager to hike frozen trails and take photos of the peaks. They won't see what we saw. Most won't even notice the silence beneath the wind. But it's there, in the stillness between footsteps, in the way sound drops off when the trees grow too dense. If they stop long enough, if they stare too deep into the woods, they might catch a glimpse, just a shape tall and still, watching from the tree line. The mute beast isn't dead. It was never meant to be. It's waiting, and the mountain is still listening.